What is unfolding in Sri Lanka, where a new cabinet is being sworn in, and this of course will be in charge of leading Sri Lanka through this very difficult period of time that Sri Lanka finds itself in. Remember, Sri Lanka is presently in the grip of its worst economic crisis that it has witnessed since its independence all the way back in 1948. Things haven't been this bad financially for the Sri Lankan people. Now, the man that you're looking at on your screens, Ranil Wickremesinghe, is the captain of the ship. He's the president of Sri Lanka, and it is up to him now to steer Sri Lanka out of this political storm and the economic storm that Sri Lanka finds itself in. A new cabinet will be put in place today. It is being sworn in as we speak, and it'll be interesting to see as to who will be the people who will be picked up by Ranil Wickremesinghe to lead the nation over the course of the next few years till elections are due again. But there are problems because the protesters are not happy with Ranil Wickremesinghe. They see Ranil Wickremesinghe as essentially a Rajapaksa man who's there to safeguard the interests of the Rajapaksa family. They want Ranil Wickremesinghe to in fact go. This is a clear demand that the protesters have now spelled out. Remember, just a fortnight ago, the protesters stormed the presidential palace in Sri Lanka. They drove out the president, and Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the man who thought that he was a strongman president of Sri Lanka and who was perhaps invincible because people had kept voting for him again and again, he had to flee from Sri Lanka because of the economic crisis there. But now Ranil Wickremesinghe is the man in charge. It will be very interesting to see as to how the protesters, of course, respond to the developments that are taking place. Overnight, the protesters have been evicted from their protest sites from in front of the presidential palace and the presidential secretariat. So the protesters are quite clearly angry. They're also waiting and watching to see how things, of course, unfold politically in Sri Lanka. At this point of time, what is needed is decisive leadership. Leadership that is wise, leadership that is pragmatic, leadership that will look at addressing the problems that Sri Lanka presently faces. There's an acute shortage of food. There's an acute shortage of fuel. People are facing power cuts for over 12, 13 hours in a day. These are the issues. It's an enormous task in front of Ranil Wickremesinghe. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be easy for any politician. But Ranil Wickremesinghe is the man who's now sitting in the hot seat. He's swearing in his new cabinet, and it'll be very interesting to see as to how things, of course, unfold in this troubled nation that has got into a lot of problems. Because firstly, of financial mismanagement. Secondly, due to an act of God, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's run out of its foreign exchange reserves. A new cabinet is now being sworn in, and this team is the team that will lead Sri Lanka forward in the days and weeks and months to come. But how much time are the people of Sri Lanka willing to give to these people, to this team that is now in charge of running the financial and political affairs of Sri Lanka, is something that we'll only get to know over the course of the next few weeks. But the protesters quite clearly are angry. There is a lull in protests because the government has just been sworn in. Ranil Wickremesinghe has just been made the president. How much time will he have to deliver the goods? Is this for something that's up for question? But at this point of time, the task is a difficult one. A new cabinet is being sworn in as we speak. We'll be getting the details of who gets which cabinet portfolio in just a bit. But this is now a crucial moment in Sri Lankan politics, and what happens from here will of course depend entirely on how well Ranil Wickremesinghe can address the big problems which other people of course have, which the people of Sri Lanka of course have, and these are problems that need to be addressed very, very urgently.
යනුව නිදහස් ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ 27 වන අග්‍රාමාත්‍යවරයා ලෙස දිනේෂ් ගුණවර්ධන මහතා ජනාධිපති රනිල් වික්‍රමසිංහ මහතා ඉදිරියේ දිරුම් දුන් අවස්ථාවේ සජීවී දර්ශනයේ ඔබට ආකාරයෙන් දැකීමට හැකියාවක් ලැබුණේ. ජනාධිපතිවරයා මේ මොහොතේදී පැමිණ සිටින පිරිස සමග සුහද කතා බහක නිරත වන ආකාරයක් අපට දැකීමට හැකියාවක් ලැබෙනවා.
These are live visuals that are being beamed straight from Colombo. These are visuals of a new cabinet being put in place by Ranil Wickremesinghe, the newly appointed president of Sri Lanka. Remember, he replaces Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who had to flee from the country after thousands of protesters decided to storm the presidential palace and the presidential secretariat. Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the strongman president of Sri Lanka, had to flee in the middle of the night, taking his suitcases. He, of course, landed up in Male, in Maldives, and from there, he, of course, had to again go on to Singapore, which also very clearly spelt out that Gotabaya Rajapaksa was there only on a short-term visa, and no political asylum had been offered to him. Now, Ranil Wickremesinghe is the man in the hot seat, and this is not going to be an easy task for Ranil Wickremesinghe or for any other leader for that matter. But the question, of course, is, has he started with the wrong foot? Because what has happened overnight is he has ordered his security forces to clear out the protesters from their protesting campsites. And this, of course, is going to make the protesters extremely angry. So how much time will Ranil Wickremesinghe have on that hot seat is something that's entirely up for speculation at this point of time. He's been in the hot seat for less than a week now. He's a six-time Prime Minister. He's a shrewd political operator. He knows the ropes and also the tricks of Sri Lankan politics. But the task that he has on his hand is not an easy one. To overturn decades of financial mismanagement, to overturn debt which Sri Lankan people simply cannot afford to pay, and also to turn around a crisis of foreign exchange reserves, where Sri Lanka has virtually completely run out of its foreign exchange. And our correspondent Dasuni Athauda has been tracking the story very closely for us. Dasuni, we're getting these live visuals that are being beamed straight from Colombo of Ranil Wickremesinghe and the new cabinet that we're given to understand is being sworn in. What more details do we have?
Well, yes, Saleh, all of you can see as right now, the new Prime Minister was just sworn in, and that was Dinesh Gunewardena, one of the most senior politicians in Parliament, who has now officially been appointed to the role of Prime Minister, who is set to work in tandem with President Wickremesinghe. So that is the latest, and what we see from the visuals are that all the MPs and ministers who are expecting ministerial posts have now come in to the office of the Prime Minister and are sort of extending their congratulations, well wishes and salutations to the newly appointed Prime Minister. That's what's happening right now with the visuals you see. Everyone is sort of extending in their congratulations and salutations to the newly appointed Prime Minister. But keep in mind, we are also expecting a swearing-in ceremony of the new cabinet of ministers, which will also sort of give us a hint as to how and if the all-party government will be taking place or will be formed in the coming few weeks as well, Saleh.
Absolutely. The fact is, Ranil Wickremesinghe will also need the support of the opposition members as well. So will the opposition, of course, play along with Ranil Wickremesinghe, lend him their support, or are we looking at more political roadblocks for the president?
Well, if you go by what the main opposition leader, Sadiq Samarat, said and tweeted yesterday, we did see that he mentioned that the opposition leader himself did meet with the newly elected president to discuss matters and sort of hinted at that support and sort of extending their support to the new president. However, what transpired in the early hours of this morning might be crucial in how the opposition views the actions of the new president, given that the opposition leader is also seen tweeting, disagreeing and denouncing what transpired in the early hours of today, where the military is swooped in and cleared out a section of the main protest site here in Colombo outside the presidential secretariat. So whether what happened in the early hours of today will impact how the opposition wants to support or show their support to the newly elected president is yet to be seen, because as of right now, the focus pretty much still remains on the appointment of the Prime Minister as well as the expected appointment of the cabinet.
Absolutely, indeed. The focus is, of course, on the cabinet that has been sworn in. But Dasuni, this is a thing about how the Sri Lankan politics has played out over the course of the last few months. It's also about how much time the protesters are willing to give to Ranil Wickremesinghe, because there's no magic wand that can be waved to wave off the problems that Sri Lanka faces. This is the biggest economic crisis that Sri Lanka presently faces. Ranil Wickremesinghe has said that things could get worse before things get better. But the question, of course, is if things get worse from here, will the protesters allow Wickremesinghe to stay on in the presidential secretariat, or will we see more protests?
So if you look at a fraction of the protesters who voiced their thoughts yesterday, especially towards the evening hours, some of them actually agreed to sort of wait and see, the concept of waiting and seeing how best the newly elected president will perform. And they were also view that they are willing to give the new president a chance so as to see how he would implement certain policies to immediately lift and elevate Sri Lanka out of the current crisis. So the general mood is that the people are currently in a phase of watching and waiting, but then again, everyone's patience has a limit, Saleh. So that's what happened on the 9th of July as well, where people's patience really drove to that tipping point. So as of right now, people appear to be sort of patiently waiting and watching. However, there is a certain sense of shock with what transpired in the early hours of today, given that the military did use excessive force and there were certain counts of assault and attacks, even on the media as well. So that's what happened today in the early hours will really sort of set the mood and the tone for how the protesters will perceive the new president.
Absolutely indeed. And also, Dasuni, at this point of time, the information that has come in is Dinesh Gunewardena is the new Prime Minister. Tell us more about Dinesh Gunewardena, and has he got a plan to pull Sri Lanka out of its deep economic crisis?
Well, Dinesh Gunewardena certainly is one of the most experienced and senior politicians. He comes from a background of politics himself. His father was one of the founders of one of Sri Lanka's first most political parties. So he has been in the field of politics as long as his life is there, because he grew up with a family of politics. But how will he really gel in well with the rest of the ministers to command the confidence of the House, to form an all-party government, are all big tasks and challenges that is sort of bestowed upon him officially now. So it will be interesting to see again in the coming few days, because these are things that are just developing here in Sri Lanka. The appointment is just made, and still everyone is in their congratulatory and well-wishing spirit to the Prime Minister Saleh.
Absolutely indeed, Dasuni. Do continue to stay on with us. This, of course, is the big story that we are tracking on WION at this hour, where Sri Lanka has got a new cabinet. This is now the team that will take the Sri Lankan politics forward, but it has a huge task on its hand. It has got the biggest economic crisis that Sri Lanka has faced in the last 7 decades that it'll have to turn around. Remember, financial mismanagement over the course of the last couple of decades, an act of God in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, resulted in the Sri Lankan economy tanking. Simple fact is, at this point of time, Sri Lanka has run out of foreign exchange reserves, and this is what has now made it almost impossible for the Sri Lankan nation as a whole to purchase essential supplies of even food, medicines and fuel from the international markets. Ranil Wickremesinghe, the man that you're looking at on your screens, is now the president. He is a 6-time Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, a very shrewd political operator, but he's got a difficult task on hand. It's a task that will be difficult pretty much for any politician who would, of course, assume power. He's now put in place a new Prime Minister and also a new cabinet. But is this team now up for the task is something that is up for question. But he seems to have got off on the wrong foot. He has evicted the protesters who were camping outside the presidential secretariat. How will the protesters, of course, respond to this? How much time will the protesters give Ranil Wickremesinghe? This is something that we'll have to wait and watch out for. Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the strongman president of Sri Lanka, was forced to flee from the country after the protesters decided to storm the presidential secretariat. Ranil Wickremesinghe is also not very popular with the protesters. Many of them say that Ranil Wickremesinghe is essentially a Rajapaksa man who's there in the chair to look after the Rajapaksa's interests. And my colleague Dasuni Thauda is, of course, tracking this story closely for us. She's joining us from Colombo to get us more details. Dasuni, this is now going to be an extremely difficult task, not just for Ranil Wickremesinghe, it would be for any politician. But Ranil Wickremesinghe is the man in the hot seat. He's now got to turn things around in Sri Lanka. pull Sri Lanka out of the worst economic crisis that it has faced since its independence. At this point of time, has he set out any targets that he wants to reach and achieve in the next 50 days, in the next 100 days, to make life easier and better for the Sri Lankan people? Have you heard anything on that front?
Well, Saleh, we have seen President Wickremesinghe speaking in his capacity as Prime Minister to the public on several occasions where he repeatedly did say that the situation in Sri Lanka is only expected to get worse in the coming months before it gets better. He is yet to address the nation as a president of the country, which is also expected in the coming few days as well. In terms of plans, we do know, again, in his capacity as Prime Minister and acting president, he did stress and harp on the fact that the IMF negotiations are still at an early stage and are expected to be finalized soon, along with discussions with the World Food Programme as well. Two key discussions right now, one with the IMF in terms of financial bailout for Sri Lanka, and one with the World Food Programme in order to avoid an impending food shortage, which we are expecting in the coming few months in the country, which will sort of turn things around again, given that hungry people are obviously angry people as well.
Absolutely. That's very well put. Hungry people are very angry people, and the protesters, I'm pretty sure, will be very angry because of what happened yesterday night, because this morning was the cabinet's swearing in. But Ranil Wickremesinghe seems to have got off on the wrong foot, because this is not something that's going to be appreciated by the protesters, where the protest sites where people were protesting peacefully near the presidential secretariat, these have now been dismantled and the protesters have been evicted by force. Have you had a chance to speak with any of the protesters? What have they got to say about Ranil Wickremesinghe's very first act before he swore in his new cabinet?
Oh, yes, I did speak to one of the protesters, one of the main activists at these protest sites who've been camping at that site for more than 2 months last night. He did reach out to me when this whole takeover was happening, and he was quite frankly in shock. And what he told me was that he himself went live on his social media towards the evening hours yesterday and did say that he is of the stance, him and his colleagues are of the stance that they are ready to sort of take a step back and give the new president a chance to sort of prove himself and allow for him to sort of implement his policies. However, they were all shocked and hurt by this move by the president for allowing the military to sort of take control of that protest site and that main stage area. Right. So that shock and that hurt still resonates with the people, which will sort of unfold again into another mix of emotions in the coming few hours here.
Absolutely, indeed. Now, Dasuni, at this point of time, I know information is only just trickling in, but do we have details as to who has been sworn for which portfolio? For instance, people in Sri Lanka and indeed around the world want to know who's now the finance minister in Sri Lanka.
Well, so far as of right now, the only confirmation we have and what we saw was the official appointment of the Prime Minister, which again is a very key and crucial decision. The appointing of the cabinet of ministers is yet to get underway, is my understanding as of right now, because soon after the Prime Minister was appointed, they did sort of break away from the formalities to sort of go and speak to the vast number of parliamentarians who had arrived at the office of the Prime Minister to sort of extend their well wishes and congratulate him. So once things calm down on that front, they will sort of continue with the swearing-in process of the all-important cabinet of Sri Lanka.
Right. Now, for people who are watching this from outside of Sri Lanka, and indeed, this is a question that they would want to know. Is this going to be, what sort of a cabinet are we expecting? Is this just from members of the ruling party, or because the government in Sri Lanka has been at pains to say that this is a government where the opposition will also have to cooperate with the government? Are we looking at, members from different parties now being taken in to be a part of the cabinet?
Yes, Saleh, I mean, when we did see how the president, soon after he was elected in parliament as president, he did appeal to all the parties to come together and to form this all-important all-party government. So this cabinet, whatever these confirmations come our way in the coming few minutes and hours, will give us an indication as to how this all-party government might be formed, provided that it is a mix of MPs from all parties representing the parliament, as opposed to a majority of posts solely given to the majority-led Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna. So that is what I think the entire nation is also now waiting to see, who will take up these important roles, such as the Minister of Energy, the Minister of Power, the Minister of Ports and Shipping, Food, all of that, agriculture, who will be sort of taking on the mantle for these tough roles, and whether this will once again be a shuffle or a mixing of the deck, as it has happened on multiple times when Sri Lanka has shifted their cabinet portfolios. Will this be one of those instances, or will this be something out of the ordinary, where you have new faces, younger faces coming into the cabinet?
Absolutely. Now, at this point of time, as things stand, we're given to understand that there is very strict food and fuel rationing, Dasuni, and it is difficult for people within Sri Lanka to move from one place to another, because there simply is no fuel unless it is for activities that are deemed to be essential. Now, for a common Sri Lankan man or woman, how easy is it to in fact walk to a petrol station and be able to purchase fuel?
Well, easy is not a word that we would use for a common Sri Lankan currently living in Sri Lanka, given that it is a well-known fact that you have to stand in line for fuel for days on end, even 4 or 5 days for some people, to just get a fuel, given that there is an acute shortage of fuel, coupled with a black market that is now sort of thriving as well. So we have that problem. And in addition to that, Sri Lankans face power cuts of up to 3 hours, which again, you have 2 hours in the morning hours and 1.5 to 1 hour towards the night. So the day of a normal Sri Lankan is now scheduled by how you can avoid a power cut efficiently by standing in line for a fuel queue at the same time. So it's pretty much on survival mode, and also shortages of food commodities are being reported. Some supermarkets, if you go to some supermarkets, even in Colombo, you will see that their shelves at times are empty, and we are expecting a food shortage in the coming few months. So life certainly is tough and difficult, which is why the people's anger and their frustration continues to be shown through these protest sites, which have been there for months on end as well, Saleh. So taking that protest site out in that fashion with such force and even assaulting the protesters sort of hurt the majority of the public, and the civil societies are largely concerned by this move, provided that it did not even take the newly appointed executive president 24 hours of his term to make such a strong and bold move.
Absolutely, indeed, because that is something that will be watched very closely by the protesters. They've been there, and many of them would say that they've been there peacefully, and peaceful protest is something which is their right. And to evict the protesters in the manner that they've been evicted in the middle of the night by the president, who's just been sworn in and who's got a huge task to turn things around with the Sri Lankan economy, is something that is not going to go down well with the protesters. Now, Dasuni, you mentioned that people may need to stand for as much as 4 or 5 days in a line to get access to fuel. You know, in Colombo, I would believe that things are slightly better. The rationing food and other supplies would be much more easily available. But if one were to go into the hinterland inside of Sri Lanka, what is the situation like? Because Sri Lanka, because of the fact that it has run out of foreign exchange reserves, has not been able to make purchases of stuff that needs to be imported. So in terms of medicines and in terms of, essential food commodities like oil, like sugar, are these things easily available?
Well, in terms, things even in Colombo appear to be quite tough, especially when it comes to this fuel shortage. But when you look at the livelihoods of those in the outskirts or even in the rural parts of Sri Lanka, which is pretty much small business owners and who are very agricultural dependent. And we know that especially since last year, the organic fertilizer approach also backfired, which again impacted on rural Sri Lanka. Adding to that, when you have a fuel shortage that is not allowing you to sort of sell your produce or send it back to Colombo to earn your means, again, that is a problem. The livelihoods of the normal person who is living in rural parts of Sri Lanka is severely impacted. And also, if you look at the children, we would see that students in this country have not been attending school quite regularly, even though children in Colombo and the suburbs will have the privilege and the access to online learning. Many rural schools still do not have that option as well. So it's really an all-rounded impact that this economic crisis has had, not only on people who are living in the suburbs, but largely on those in rural areas as well, Saleh.
Absolutely indeed. Dasoni, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Colombo and getting us all those insights there. This, of course, is an extremely difficult time for the people in Sri Lanka. A new executive president is in place, Ranil Wickremesinghe, but has he been taking the right decisions? He seems to have got off on the wrong start by clearing off the protest sites by using what many would describe as excessive force, especially considering the fact that those protesters were camping near the presidential secretariat peacefully. They'd been there for several weeks now, and to oust them just a day before a new cabinet was sworn in is something that is not going to go down well with the protesters. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.